Here's story time. Here's another story from The Coastal Ghost, written by Nancy Rhyme, 1926. Haunted places from Wilmington, North Carolina to Savannah, Georgia. And this is called The Liza Tree. Eliza was Sarah Barnard's body servant, and she labored at the plantation house at the time it was purchased by William Baynard. It was about that time, from one streak of suggestion to another, that Sarah had began to surmise that William was enjoying Eliza's charm. Something more intimate was going on between the two, and Sarah just knew it. She took it upon herself to find out what was going on. One day, as evening was about to creep onto the Hilton Head Island, Sarah threw her black shawl over her head and left the mansion. She intended to wander along the marshlands for a mile or two, and then just happened to return home by the way of Eliza's cabin. At that time, Hilton Head Island was a singular place. It consisted of little else on the sea, sand dunes covered with sea oats, cotton plantations, and what seemed to be miles of marshlands and miles of forest. The island was separated from mainland South Carolina by a creek oozing the way it was through the wilderness of cord grass and slime and shore birds. The route that Sarah chose was scant in the growth other than the marsh grass, but Eliza's cabin was encircled by a large live oaks draped in Spanish moss. No one noticed that the lovely Sarah, as she slowly made her way along the marsh, for it was not her wont to leave the mansion, except to travel in her extraordinarily beautiful black carriage. It bore the Baynard coat of arms and was always pulled by 4 matching black horses. Even though the stroll was distressing to her due to her mission, it soon took a kind of joy. In her whole life she had scarcely taken notice of the palmettos waving in the breeze, the Spanish sword thrusting from the sand, and the erratically growing limbs of the live oak, overhanging the gauzy icicles of Spanish moss. It came to her that as she traveled in her carriage, she rarely lifted the lace curtain at the window. The wax myrtle and Yaupon holly were not identifiable to her, but their beauty caught her eye. She could identify the wild smilax, for she had used it in decorations at the Christmasade. Before Sarah realized it had grown quite late, and the wild smilax, for she had used it decorations at the Christmasade. Before Sarah realized it, it had grown quite late, and the moon had ripened into a fiery orange melon that soldered above the beach. Quickly she turned and walked into the direction of the slate cabins. The birds had gone to roost now, and all was quiet, and as she strolled towards the cabin, moving from behind the one oak tree to another, the vegetation that had been thrilling only moments before now became gloomy. The Spanish moss swung gently in the breeze, throwing unexpected shadows on Sarah's face and in her path. Although she was disturbed, she went on, and her mission was accomplished. In her solitary walk, she wondered what creatures hunkered down behind each wax myrtle, each yaupon. Was it true that the slates talked about? Was there such creatures as platt-eye, hags, haints, boo-daddies, and ghosts who live in these woods? Now, a new horror presented itself. What if indeed she saw her husband in the cabin of her maid, Eliza? What would she do? But they were still the most singular. She kept her eye on a path, and she darted from the tree to tree. Eliza's cabin was the first in the double row of the small houses. Sarah surmised that Eliza's bedroom would be at the rear, so she pulled her shawl tightly around her head and quietly walked to the back of the house. A lamp had been lit. Eliza was moving about the room. Even Sarah at the moment had to admit that the loveliness of Eliza was that of an ancient queen. It was true that she was a maiden, artless and innocent in the social graces, but a natural beauty hers was unsurpassed on the Hilton Head Island. Eliza was alone, but she prepared for her bed, and Sarah sighed as if a deadly burden had been lifted from her breast. But she couldn't take her eyes off Eliza, who was now lifting a thin leg to the back of the chair. She attached to the ankle a gold chain that swung her leg from the chair. Then, with a grace of shapelessness, she swung her other leg to the back of the chair. On that ankle, she placed a chain of gold. As Sarah thought about it, those chains looked for a world like the 2 chains in her collection. But how in the world could Eliza have come into possession of these chains from Sarah's collection? Eliza wiggled her lithesome figure from a dress. Her figure, as seen as Sarah out in the darkness, was a brazen cloud, floating as though if it was known, and the feeling of satin and gold. Just at the very moment, Eliza did something that so stunned Sarah that the horror would go with her for the rest of her life. The maiden servant opened the drawer of a rustic chest and removed a chain of gold, richly gleamed in the lamplight. As Eliza held it up, she recognized that it was her brooch on a gold chain. How in the world had Eliza gotten her hands on it? The naked Eliza turned, and the emerald in the brooch caught the light that was in the flash of the sword in Sarah's heart. But her heart was to be stabbed even deeper. Just then her husband William stepped back up to Eliza and hooked the clasp of gold chain at the back of her neck. So it was true. Sarah's husband was carrying on with the servant girl, and in such a outrageous, ugly, unholy way, to such a horrid circumstances. With the servant girl, that was one thing, but to steal her jewelry and give it to Eliza was quite another.